Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for part 4 of Going Public in Canada, a fireside chat series for a behind-the-scenes look at what it takes to make the move from private to public. My name is Matt Imrie, and I'm a senior associate in the corporate securities group here at Dentons. I'll be leading the discussion, and today I'm joined by Mark Lau and Michael DeCosima. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Mark is currently the Chief Legal Officer of Payfare, a TSX-listed fintech company that completed its initial public offering in March of 2021. Previous to Payfare, he served as VP of Legal and General Counsel for Tarago Inc., another TSX-listed company that offers wireless connectivity and private 5G network services. Mark articled and began his legal career at a full-service national firm on Bay Street as a corporate and securities lawyer.
Thanks for having me.
Michael practices corporate and securities law here at Dentons. He has an emphasis on corporate governance, corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions, investment funds, and private equity. Michael has acted as issuer's counsel on over 75 initial public offerings and other private and public offerings, raising aggregate gross proceeds of over $8 billion. So now you've had a chance to meet our panelists, let's dive into the discussion. So our first topic today is going to be about getting ready for going public, and namely how to set up and structure a board of directors prior to going public. So Michael, maybe you could start us off by just giving us some things to think about when structuring a board prior to a go public.
Thanks, Matt. Nice to see you, and Mark, and thanks for you both joining, and thanks to all our guests today. We look forward to spending the next half an hour with you talking about some of these interesting topics. Going public, before I talk about boards, I just wanted to say generally that going public is often a very exciting opportunity for a company and its investors. And it does involve, though, a number of governance issues that need to be sorted out and should be considered and addressed. And the sooner you do that, the better the outcome will likely be for the benefit of all stakeholders. Assuming you've made the decision to go public, there's a number of ways you can do this. You can do it by way of an IPO, a reverse takeover, and get involved with a SPAC. We'll assume for purposes of today's discussion that we're just talking about a straight taking a company public by way of an IPO. There are a number of exchanges that we have in Canada that you may list on, including the Toronto Stock Exchange, the TSXV, the CSE, and the NEO. They each have slightly different requirements, and it may depend on the type of company exactly we're talking about, the industry, the market capitalization, and a number of other factors. So depending on all that will factor into the discussion and the analysis. And then the other thing that you'll want to think about is are you just listing in Canada, or do you want to dual list? Do you want to list somewhere else, likely in the US or maybe somewhere else in the world? Our advice will always be, with respect to all these things, to start the process early, start thinking about it early, engage with your legal advisors and your financial advisors early in the process. And I did want to put a plug in for Dentons that before we even get started, saying that at Dentons, we're extremely well positioned to assist you with any of these options with our national presence in Canada, having offices in all the major jurisdictions in Canada, as well as being the largest law firm in the world. No matter where you want to list, no matter what type of going public transaction you want to do, or where you're operating your business, we are well served or well positioned to service you in Canada or around the world. So please keep that in mind. With respect to Matt's specific question on the board, establishing a new board for a new public company, it may take longer than you expect. There's a number of things that you have to take into account, and a number of regulatory things that you also want to be doing behind the scenes to make sure that there's no glitches upon the big go public day. So in addition to the statutory requirements, and each statute has slightly different requirements, whether it's Ontario, the OBCA, Canada, CBCA, or some other jurisdiction in Canada. So you have to be mindful of residency requirements or some other type of requirements under the corporate statutes. But you also have to consider what makes sense as far as the size of the board, the diversity, the expertise that the board needs to bring, and the independence. And all those things will be taken into account. And one way to kind of sort this all out is to do a skills matrix to try to keep track of all those factors. The other thing that you're going to want to make sure you do early is your due diligence. You know, we all think you may know somebody, but until you actually start actually doing real due diligence into the person or the candidate, you want to make sure that you're not going to be surprised, both at the company level, but also at the regulatory level. And we can help with all that. Most boards are going to require 3 independent directors for the audit committee and just generally. So those are all things that you'll have to take into account with respect to trying to sort out the size of the board and all the other things that I just mentioned. As far as the you don't have to have it perfect. The board will evolve as the company grows. And, practically speaking, most people reach out to people that they know to see if there's interest or people that they can get on the board. And in some cases, they have to get a placement agent or placement firm to help find a specific candidate where there may be gaps.
And I think to Michael's point on that as well, he touched a little bit on the residency requirements and diversity. And those requirements are literally changing on a month-by-month basis. So it's always important to kind of stay on top of those and make sure you're up to date on the latest and greatest. Mark, anything to add from an in-house perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think from a practical standpoint, I'll just add that in terms of a board size, you want to think about ensuring that you have a big enough board, or at least have a path or a plan to get to a certain size, so that you do have a variety of skill sets and experiences to leverage off of, especially in those early years of public company life. Plus, depending on the size of your company, having a decent sized board will help to ensure that individual directors do not take on too much, being burdened with too many committee positions. As a TSX issuer, for example, you'll usually have 3 subcommittees at least, the standard ones being your audit, compensation committee, and some sort of nomination/governance committee, each of which will have their own mandates to satisfy. And of course, separate sets of meetings and reading materials to review. And when you think you have at least 3 directors on each committee, and if you've only got 5 or 6 directors on your board to start with, you kind of end up with a few directors who are ultimately stuck serving on most, if not all, those committees, which may not be an ideal situation, both in terms of the workload for them, or just not having the necessary breadth of candidates in the director pool to fill those committees. And remember, not everyone is going to be qualified to be on every committee. For example, audit committee members have to be financially literate, which is a requirement to serve on those committees. They don't all have to be CPAs, but as part of going public, you do want to ask, do you have enough directors on the board to fill a 3-person audit committee? Similarly, on the compensation committee, under securities laws, you're going to be required to disclose annually in a circular whether such members have, experience on executive compensation, do they have skills or experiences to make decisions on compensation policies. And then finally, don't forget that, many of the committee positions, require majority, if not fully independent directors. So your CEO founder who's on the board, he's generally not going to be able to sit on the audit committee. And so this goes right back to the question, do you have a big enough board in the first place? And then on the flip side, you have to balance that with having too big a board, which makes it tough to coordinate getting anything done. Simple things like scheduling a meeting with a large group of directors who may reside all around the world in different time zones is a constant challenge that we deal with day in and day out now. Very much like herding cats, especially if you've ever had experience trying to schedule a last minute ad hoc meeting with a large board. So Matt, I would say, those are a few things one should consider when trying to structure a board, especially as it relates to its size ahead of going public.
And I think you made a good point there, Mark. Like, it's really important to make sure that they have the skills and the expertise necessary for not only the industry that you're in, but the size of the organization and the aspirations for the organization. And it can take a long time to identify those people and get those people on board. So it is important to start that process early, just given some of the complexities with really identifying the right individuals and making sure they fit with what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
So
The other thing we should just add is diversity. There's lots of different types of diversity. There's a lot of emphasis on gender diversity, but there's ethnicity, age, areas of expertise, industry, geographic, and the CBCA is relatively recently, has these designated groups, which includes women, Aboriginal peoples, persons with disabilities, and members of visible minorities. So there's a number of things when we talk about diversity that you have to be mindful of.
Absolutely. So we'll move on to the next topic now. And the next topic is something that I think the three of us probably deal with very regularly. And depending on how you look at it, is maybe one of the more burdensome or one of the more exciting parts of going public, and that's continuous disclosure. So I think most people are aware that there is some level of disclosure that's required, but I think, Michael, maybe if you could start by just walking us through some of what those important continuous disclosure obligations are to keep in mind when you're thinking about going public.
Sure, thanks, Matt. So continuous disclosure, when people think of going public, they typically, assuming you hear the term IPO, initial public offering, most times that's referring to a prospectus type of offering that's done at the same time the company is being listed on an exchange. And so whether it's a prospectus or some other document like just a disclosure statement, you've got to make sure that the document is full, true, plain disclosure and accurately reflects the business. And so that can take a lot of time, more time than people think. And so it's best to start thinking about how do you draft all the disclosure that needs to go in these documents to tell the story about what the business is in a full and accurate manner, so that you have a document that is useful from a marketing perspective, but also from a legal perspective. There's no misrepresentations, because the one thing that officers and directors have to remember is that there's liability associated with these documents. So it's critically important that they don't contain a misrepresentation. So that is fundamental. The other thing that's a fundamental thing that you should be doing, any company should be doing, especially depending on the history of the company and if any acquisitions have been made, is engaging with their auditors and their legal counsel very early to understand exactly what financial statements are going to be required with respect to the go public transaction. There's a number of parameters that need to be considered and what will need to be included. And it can be relatively simple sometimes, but sometimes it can be very complex. And so you want to make sure that you have that understanding well in advance of your plans, so that you can get the auditors going on what needs to be done for the prospectus or other disclosure statement. That's really a crucial step on an ongoing basis. And many times that single financial statement point alone is a gatekeeper item, and can be can seriously delay deals because of that if you don't do it properly and you don't do it in a timely manner. On an ongoing basis, you got to remember, once you're a public company, you have continuous disclosure obligations. So you have ongoing financial statements, MD&A. You have to have annual shareholder meetings with an information circular with all kinds of disclosure that's mandated in that circular, and typically an annual information form. And there's a whole rule set out on most of these things that you need to be concerned about. You also have to be concerned about material change reporting, insider reporting, and filing press releases in a timely manner. And those are things that certainly Dentons can assist with any of that.
And I think to Michael's point there on potential liability for the corporation, something to keep in mind is corporations quite often move fast, especially when they're growing. And one kind of aspect of growing pains is making sure that the information from those conducting the day-to-day operations gets through the appropriate channels to the individuals who are responsible for continuous disclosure. So whether that be the legal team or the executive team, just making sure that everyone's kept informed so that disclosure can be made in a timely manner and up to the standards that it needs to match. And I know that's often a growing pain for companies. So Mark, maybe you could talk a little bit about the processes that at Payfair you guys have instituted to make sure that information gets from the basic level of where the events are occurring to the right channels and the right people for the purposes of continuous disclosure.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a shift that needs to happen once you go public, and you got to ensure that you have some like good corporate hygiene that may not be necessary there when you're operating as a private company. To start, here at Payfair, we host weekly meetings with the entire executive team where we're bringing up and discussing important updates happening at each corner of our company. If you're running legal at your shop and you don't already have that regular cadence where you're getting a download of what's going on from the broader team, I think it's super important for you to ensure you get that seat invitation to the table, because other than allowing you to provide timely advice on a particular topic, it's going to give you a heads up on what is going on and what may be upcoming material events or news where you may have an obligation to disclose, including via press release. And so the more advance notice you get on some of these things, the more time you get to properly prepare and come up with disclosure that, let's call it a better quality. And then to supplement all that, to ensure that, we get all information, material information flowing up to the legal department, we've implemented a system of internal certifications that we request from each department head on a quarterly basis. And those certifications kind of coincide with our quarterly financial earnings cycle. And it's just another check where each of our executive officers, they'll confirm whether they've shared all material information, unusual transactions, related party transactions, their awareness of any claims, and just assurances that they have certain controls in place within their departments. And I find that requirement for your team to review a set checklist of items every quarter before I ask them to sign off will help catch anything that may otherwise have been overlooked. And sometimes that process does initiate a further discussion with me, and where you're ultimately including new disclosure or commentary in an MD&A or other continuous disclosure document. So I hope a little of that insight on what we do at Payfair can give some of the webinar participants today something to think about on what you may like to do on your own disclosure processes.
And I think that's very helpful, and that is something that I think has really worked for some of our other clients as well, having meetings and having certifications, just making sure there are strong open lines of communication, really.
For sure.
So the next topic is one that I'm sure people have seen in the news a lot, especially over the last 5 to 10 years, and it's about corporate governance and trends in corporate governance. So Michael, maybe you could start off by just telling us a little bit about some of the recent trends you've seen in the corporate governance space generally.
Sure, thanks, Matt. There's the continues to be a very hot topic is diversity, which we've already touched on a little bit, but you can't. It's been a topic that's been a topic of discussion and mandated to have, for example, disclosure in various documents about women on the board. But yet, there's been some progress, but not as much progress as I think people would like to see. And so that continues to be a very hot topic. The regulators just recently put out their recent report with respect to some of the surveys and results of what they've seen. And currently, 24% of board seats in Canada have women or were women. About 87% of boards have at least one woman on the board, and 30% of boards have at least 3 women. I think that's better than it was 10 years ago, but not where people would like to see it. And hopefully we can continue to make progress in that regard. With respect to diversity, so that's gender diversity. With respect to other types of diversity, there is this concept of designated groups, and people should be, especially if you're a CBCA company, you should be mindful of that because it's required to disclose or make disclosure or explain rationale on how decisions are being made within the company at the board and executive level. But everyone should be, these are trends that are happening regardless of whether it's mandated or not. They're trends that are happening that companies should be mindful of and should be considering in their corporate governance. ESG, environmental, social, and governance, is another huge topic that is in the newspaper daily these days. There's proposed rules in Canada on some climate-related matters and some guidance on ESG disclosure. What my biggest feedback would be on ESG disclosure is, don't be greenwashing. Don't be saying that your ESG or this what you're doing with respect to ESG just to derive a benefit. The company should be very mindful and very clear on what it is that you're doing, how is it measured, and how is it monitored, so that you can stand by whatever it is you're saying, so that investors in the company are relying on that information, but also you should be able to support it if ever challenged. And I think we'll see more and more of that as things progress. Disclosure in that regard should not just be boilerplate. It should be very tailored to specifically match whatever your ESG policies are. The other ones that continue to be around are majority voting type policies. CBCA, of course, mandates this now, but other depending on if you're OBCA or listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange, you have to be mindful of having such policies, or at least explain why you don't have such policy. And the other thing that companies should be aware of, and it depends on the size, because a lot of times it's more in line for institutional investors and may be more relevant to larger companies, but ISS and Glass Lewis are proxy advisory firms, and they prepare and put out guidelines, including constantly making sure there's diversity on the board, environmental and social oversight, and cyber risk oversight are some of the hot topics that continue to be on their agenda.
And that's great. And I think building a little bit on Michael's point, and he touched on it briefly, is it really does depend on the size of your organization and where your organization is trying to go. And it is important to kind of consider this, because there really isn't a one size fits all when it comes to corporate governance or breadth of disclosure. It really is organization dependent, and it's important to think about these things and discuss these things with your advisors, so you can really you can make a strategy that works for you as an organization and where you're trying to go. Mark, kind of building on that, maybe speaking about either recent trends in corporate governance or changes in the economic environment. Can you talk a little bit about how that's impacted your role or Payfair generally?
Yeah, for sure, Matt. Kind of assessing and updating your disclosure based on what's going on in the world and the impact to your public company business is something you're consistently doing. My comments here touch more on hot topic issues, and probably in the last couple of years, I think, like most issuers, the disclosure on how the COVID-19 pandemic has or will impact your company is something that we all kind of scratched our head and had to contend with. I think none of us in-house lawyers will hold or want to hold ourselves out to be subject matter experts on something like that. But you certainly need to get yourself up to a level of knowledge where you are able to evaluate it intelligently, comment on it, and ultimately prepare disclosure that can be said to be full, true, and plain. And I think that's where you need to do your research, educate yourself, have discussions with your teams for sure, and discuss with external counsel as necessary. My additional advice on these hot topic issues is to attend sessions like these. I find that the Bay Street law firms are great at being timely and on point with lunch hour sessions on such topics, whether it was on COVID-19, this inflationary recession that we keep hearing about, or privacy and security threats, which is always a very pertinent topic for a tech company like Payfare. I always find good nuggets of free information and guidance from each of those sessions that I will factor in when doing my disclosure drafting, because they will change your risk factor disclosure or the guidance or forward-looking information that you've disseminated into the market, or discussions that you're going to be forced to have on what kind of proactive or reactionary measures your company is taking in light of the events happening around the world.
Yeah, that's great. And I think one thing that people quite often think about when they hear the word corporate governance is ESG, especially lately. But it's a good point that you're making, Mark. It really is. It's what's impacting your business that you need to be thinking about. It that may be ESG, and I think ESG is in a way impacting all businesses. But there are other things that are important to consider, and COVID's a big one that impacted a lot of our clients and really made them think about how they disclose the risk of stuff like that to their business. So that's a great point. Appreciating that we only have a couple minutes left. We were hoping to speak about corporate policies, but I don't think we have time. I do think it's important, though, to give each of Michael and Mark just an opportunity to give a couple pieces of advice, one or two pieces of advice that you would give to executives or in-house counsel that are thinking about making the jump and going public.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I will just put a mention though about, we won't get into all the mandates, charters, policies, all that. But one thing that is crucial is whether it's your disclosure and your documents or putting together these policies, don't just take a policy and then just copy it, or just, not make sure you understand what's in the policy or in the disclosure or in the risk factor. Don't just put boilerplate. Make sure it's tailored to what your company's actually doing. And the other thing with policies to make sure is, yes, you have to have them. And they're very important, but make sure that the right people in the company are aware of them, and they've been made aware of what the policies are, and that there's some acknowledgement that they've received and read them. That's a big point, because you don't want to just have a policy and then have it sitting somewhere that no one's aware of or has any acknowledgement that they've read it. With respect to concluding kind of statements or thoughts, we've covered a lot in a very short period of time. Each of the topics probably could have been a half an hour session or longer on their own. If anyone has any questions or would like follow up, feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to, have a further more detailed discussion with you. But, one thing I wanted to just highlight is it's a relatively slow IPO market right now, but this process takes a long time to do it properly and thoughtfully. And so this is a perfect time, or at least a very good time, to be getting your mind around what's necessary and getting things in order now, so that on the next market upturn, you're well positioned to go public.
Thanks, Michael. And maybe I'll just wrap up by saying, the obligations and requirements of being a public company, doesn't just fall on the legal department. I think if you can instill a certain public company mindset early on amongst your counterparts and the leaders in different areas of your company, that they will play a role in continuous disclosure, working with the board or administering policies. If you get that in, it'll make the process of going public and the day-to-day life afterwards a lot more manageable.
And Mark, you probably would agree that document this, like put the policies in writing, put things in writing, have things in writing, so it's not just, so it's easy to, and the more organized you can be, probably the easier it will be for everyone to go through the process.
Yeah, 100% agree.
Absolutely. And you're right, Mark, it's a very disruptive process going public. So the more buy-in you can have from everyone at the organization, I think that really smooths the process and makes it a lot easier. So given that we are unfortunately out of time, and that went much faster than I think any of us would have expected, we won't have time to answer the questions. However, as Michael said, please feel free to reach out to the extent you do have any questions, and and we'll do our best to answer them, as well as the few that we've received during this this chat. So thank you again for taking the time to join us today as we discussed some of the corporate governance aspects of going public, and enjoy the rest of your day. And especially thank you to Mark and Michael for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.